thank you for joining me. Today is my guest, Matthew Ehret. He is a journalist, a lecturer, and editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review. He's also a senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, BRI Expert, and Tactical Talk, and a co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. His writings can also be found in Strategic Culture, Washington Times, and The Cradle. Most notably, he has authored a 3-volume set known as The Untold History of Canada and a 2-volume set known as The Clash of the Two Americas. So, Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me on. And just as a quick corrective, the 3-volume set of The Untold History of Canada turned into 4 volumes, and the 2-volume Clash of the Two Americas just turned into a trilogy of 3 volumes. So, other than that, everything else is great.
Okay, have to update myself. Okay, getting into things. Have to admit, in preparation for this interview, it was a little bit harder than usual because it's just so much information and it goes back such a long way. I had a hard time to kind of piecing it together, but I was hoping if we could start off with maybe give a little bit information about yourself to begin with, and how you got into the type of topics that you're into.
Sure. Yeah, we can start that way. That's a nice lawful way to begin. Yeah. So for myself, I didn't really enter this in a conventional way in terms of the idea of history research, geopolitical analysis. Although that is what my passion is and what I mostly do nowadays. My entry into this entire sort of mode was through the arts. I was working in fine arts and film in Montreal, and it was becoming. I found myself doing things that were somewhat deconstructionist in nature. The ethos within my film program was of a very abstract philosophy that art is only good if you make your audience squirm uncomfortably in their seats, and every single teacher within the department all believed the same sort of thing. But I found myself deconstructing my ideas. So if you were developing an intelligible intention, an idea for your audience with a purpose, that was seen essentially as not art or bad art or something to be punished through being given bad marks or failures. So I found myself doing something unhealthy to myself. I didn't fully understand why it was so unhealthy, but I knew it was wrong. I knew that art, like I kind of wanted to do art that was, ideally beautiful, ideally that had a message. I think that's a very human thing to want. And so that was weird. But I didn't have a very strong political sensibility about me. I didn't know about, I didn't have a strong critique of anything. So it was only when I found myself working with a few colleagues who were building a little documentary on 9/11, or at least it touched on 9/11, and I found myself needing to do a bit of research on my own so that I could contribute my portion of the work in a useful way, that I found myself watching some lectures and watching some documentaries and reading some material that blew my mind. I essentially, that was my wake up call. So I was sort of going at it with a bit of a blank slate, and I didn't really have a strong, like I said, a strong intellectual identity. So I was just sort of like building from nothing. And it's a bit traumatic, as most people listening, I think, have experienced in their own ways, waking up to realizing that everybody around you is a giant mind slave. And it's not their fault, like it's a tragedy. You feel pain because it's like, oh, all my loved ones, everybody, my entire society has been tricked into walking into a slaughterhouse. So I found myself, yeah, go on.
You're really preaching to the choir there. You sound a lot of parallels with you and me, actually. But go on.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, I became, I became obsessed with just trying to piece things together in a more critical way. And obviously, one thing leads to another, because 9/11 didn't happen in a vacuum. So the question was, well, what's the broader continuity? How did this happen? So I started working on a little bit more history. And I had a good instinct, at the very least, of trying to get source material. So, rather than reading about things on Wikipedia, I tried to, at the very least, read the writings of people who made things happen for good or for bad. So that was a good inclination that paid off, I think. But after a little while, I still didn't have a sense of solutions. I just had a pretty good grasp of why we're all screwed. Bankers' conspiracies, multi-generational conspiracies. That means that, there's a lot of power in the hands of a very evil oligarchical clique. That's not very empowering. So at a certain point, I realized, well, I'm just going to shut up, because the more I'm talking to people, and the more if they don't think I'm crazy and I'm persuasive, then they're at the very least depressed and disempowered. So I was like, okay, better, ignorance maybe is bliss. So I shut up for a while, for about a year and a half. And I told myself, I'm going to try to keep this all to myself and try to live my life in my dual reality, live in my private life, try to figure out, the truth, and then living my public life in my 9-to-5 job and whatever else. But that wasn't healthy either. And I had a pledge that if I should come across anybody who has a sense of a solution that could work, that appeals to my reason, I will give it my all. But and I'll talk about this as if it's the only thing to talk about, but until then, I'm not. And I was on a smoke break after work one day. And there was a political table in around summer of 2006. And they had some signage. So it was a political organizing group, which had signs of, stop the depopulation agenda. They had literature, and I started talking to them, and there were things I disagreed with, but I found that there was a lot of resonance. They were somewhat organized, trying to do something, and it was a small outlet here in Canada, where I live, from a US-based organization called the LaRouche Organization, which was set up by a recently deceased American economist named Lyndon LaRouche. He ran for the presidency many times, and I thought I was a very well-known person, or not a well-known. I thought I was a very knowledgeable person, and I never heard of this person, Lyndon LaRouche. I never heard of the organization, so I was a bit surprised to find a pretty good cohesive analysis, and also, most importantly, a set of solution concepts that I thought were viable, that would recognize the power of the nation state, in terms of having a key role to play in breaking the private banking structures that had embedded themselves in every country of the world, how this had been done for the good in the past. And I became a volunteer with that organization, with its Canadian outlet. It had maybe 8 or 9 members. It was very small, but it was something that I thought was important. And so I did that for a number of years. And in the course of organizing in Canada politically, because like I said, it was an American organization, there wasn't a lot of any messaging that could resonate or connect with a Canadian audience, I was supposed to talk to Canadians. But, I'm saying, like, here, impeach Dick Cheney, impeach Obama from Canada. Like, that doesn't work. So I found myself with a few friends frustrated, and we decided to put ourselves on a bit of a mission to piece together Canadian history from this more critical standpoint, which was a multi-year project. And when we started producing some results, we were able to then better analyze what were the power structures in Canada, which I don't think anybody had done that way before, with a certain sense of what were their weaknesses, what were the pathways to getting a national bank of Canada, how had it worked in the past, how could it work again, things like that. And it was inspiring some people. And I started a Canadian journal in around summer of 2012 called the Canadian Patriot Review, to sort of compile a lot of this research, which I couldn't get published anywhere else. So I was like, well, I have to, I guess, just do it myself. And that's been about a decade that's been going on. And since then, I've branched out after Trump was elected, to writing in other journals as well. And in 2019, I started a nonprofit with my wife, Cynthia, who's also a writer for Strategic Culture. And that's called the Rising Tide Foundation. So that's sort of in a 5-minute, maybe 10-minute span, sort of how I got into it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. As I said, it sounds similar to my own experience, but maybe we can get into that another time. But
What was your experience like? How did you enter this?
well, my story was when I was growing up, I wasn't very academic in school,
Right.
and I kind of floated around. I had a little bit of interest in history, but that's about it. And when I hit 25, I'm 30, turning 38 now. So it's been a while now. But when I hit 25, I discovered by accident Ron Paul, you know,
Hmm.
and then from there I discovered Infowars.
Right.
Alex Jones was interviewing Ron Paul pretty regularly back then,
Hmm.
and I started to listen to Jones, but also the guests that he had on at the time were fascinating. People like Alan Watt of cuttingthroughthematrix.com, I think passed away now. Webster Tarpley, he was also part of the LaRouche movement
Hmm.
on stage, um, and all these other people. And at the very least, it was at least interesting. And even though I had a sense of history and I was kind of good at my history, but even I always had questions about the official story of how things played out.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, they kind of did fill in some blanks or confirm some of my own suspicions. I
Hmm.
then, like you said, you kind of start connecting the dots. So you start with history, and then you go to economics, and then you go to politics, and then you go to this and that, and international relations, and then it becomes you
Yeah.
become entrenched.
Yeah.
And so I basically self uh, educated myself for about 2 years, and then I decided to go to university, and I ended up doing international relations there. And partly was because I thought, okay, am I just brainwashing myself? Am I just living in a vacuum, or am I want to test
Hmm.
these ideas. So I
Yeah.
went to university and I did, and looking back, I'm not too sure how I passed, considering the type of essays I was handing in. They were quite, you know, different compared to others,
Hmm.
and then yeah, then from there I went from university to my undergraduate, did my masters, and then I always had this idea of, like, similar to you, like I'll set up a journal or set up get some uni friends together and we can do something like that. But they were kind of interested but not really committed, so it never really went anywhere. So it's only until recently I decided to kind of put my academic uh, background. I wanted to actually use it, and I set it
Yeah.
up. I set up my own website and business. So
Nice.
yeah, there was some, yeah. Well, as you were talking, I'm going, yeah, I know that feeling. I remember coming home from work when I was 25. I was working as a mailroom operator, so there were times during the day where we was kind of quiet, so I had time to just to go on the internet, and I would be, researching or listening to these interviews, and I'd be coming home with my world kind of crashing down around me, like my
Yeah.
my sense of history and everything was completely shaken. But it was a good feeling though, because then you realize, okay, what's happening, what's going on.
Well, see, for me, that was a big aha because I realized, and I had encountered some of these ideas before I had my decision, because it's a decision ultimately to embrace the truth. And I had been stubborn. And for a couple of years, I had a few experiences with people who were trying to introduce me to conspiracy theories. And they did a very bad job, I got to say. They were a friend, an ex-girlfriend, and, they were sort of in the lizard people mode.
Uh,
And, and so it wasn't very it was sloppy. It was expecting too much blind faith on my part to go along with that journey. And so I brushed it off. And it was only when I encountered in the course, like I said, of doing the research for that particular documentary that touched on 9/11, that I found myself having to do my own research. And I was listening to a variety of lectures that I had downloaded at the time. It was 2002 or 2003, and BitTorrents were a big thing. And I found myself listening to, I think Mike Rupert was an early lecturer, somebody who was a 9/11 researcher, an investigative journalist, a very rigorous person. He recently, well, not recently, but he passed away. But I found myself for the first time encountering a rational, every single step of the way I could follow everything you were saying. And so things that I thought were unprovable, you just proved. And you took my mind not for granted. You took me through the discovery process with you, to the point that I couldn't be the same. I mean, I could. A lot of people would experience this sort of thing and they were like, well, that was interesting.
Well,
Good night. I'm going to go back to my my illusion, but I couldn't do that, as many people cannot. But the empowering thing was that if it is knowable, it's teachable. If it's teachable, there's hope. If it's just the shadowy force of evil with their own secret knowledge for the inner elites that have been maintaining itself for God knows how long, if that's all it is, this shadowy, occultish type of dark force, that's ultimately not provable, but you kind of just can believe it, you're screwed. There's nothing we can really do. And so
you can as you're saying, it can just be depressing, where bad people are doing things. It's kind of learned helplessness, where what can you do? You're
exactly.
yeah. Okay, well, getting into things now. As we kind of mentioned that shadowy forces and all that. Um, I believe nowadays it's kind of more known as shorthand is more like globalism, or modern day times is the deep state. But this idea has gone back a long time. At least in modern day times, I think it started off has many names like the Invisible Empire, the Invisible Government, the New World Order, the Anglo-American establishment. Um, how would you define exactly what is globalism, or what is this this agenda?
It's a good question. And like you said, there's so many labels that everyone's trying to say the same thing. They're trying to essentially put words on something which is difficult to peg down. But I think if I were to try to get at the invariant, the common denominator amongst all attempts and all expressions of this thing, which has been around for thousands of years, going back to ancient history, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, before that, ancient Babylonian records, there's evidence that society had been organized for the most part by an oligarchical class, which have, despite the fact that they organize themselves around certain family bonds and certain traditions that they maintain, it's less material and more psycho-spiritual, cultural. So there's sort of a cultural dynamic that is oligarchical, which is different from the sort of cultural field that most people live in and go to school in and watch TV in and experience, that shapes their souls. Because culture is essentially, it's like the soil that the seed of our soul grows in, and you could have bad soil or good soil. You could have rich, good, fertile soil that brings out the best of your seed's capabilities, or you could have a really rotten,
Crop.
Which makes bad seeds, and bad seeds make bad roots, and I think the oligarchy is something which is holding on to obsolete, irrational traditions based on a flawed, false concept of what human nature is, what the universe is that human beings were created into. And they're committed to certain core assumptions that, for example, human beings are born, as Aristotle says in his Politics, that you have, a natural order of slaves and masters, that you have one virtue that you could define for the slave, one morality for the slave, one virtue and one morality for the masters, one virtue for the, and he sort of breaks everything down into this somewhat crystallized situation without recognizing that, no, these are conventions. You're born, you don't choose the times, and you don't choose the injustice of the world that you're born into. He doesn't recognize that. It's just like, if there is injustice, it must be part of the social order of nature. And that's a bit of a leap. So I think the oligarchy presumes one of the invariants behind globalism, which is itself just it's a term, the idea of globalization is a term that was generated a few generations ago in the early 70s, I think, is when it began to be bandied about in the modern form, or late 70s, of an idea of essentially stripping nation states of their active role in world affairs, especially economic affairs, and creating a post-nation state order, which would involve essentially supranational entities that would take over the controls of what was formerly nation states in everything: military, cultural policy, scientific, economic, every policy. This is what Klaus Schwab, another name for that is the, stakeholder capitalism. We had shareholder capitalism, which was basically extract as much value for your shareholders in your company as much as possible. No boundary conditions, right? No national regulation. That was 1971 all the way up until the current collapse really hit. So it was sort of a pirate free-for-all, just might makes right, just do what you got to do. Ultimately, you always had this oligarch, even though nations were being stripped, and we were told, oh, it'll be more free if everything is privatized, right? Less monopolies, less bureaucracy if private companies end up owning everything. Well, ultimately, those companies were still under, the control of certain agencies like the Bilderberger Group, or what became later on the Davos Club. So it was, that was a fraud. It's not like we got more economic opportunity or incentive. We had decay, in fact, for the past 40 years straight. And now we're at a collapse function where all of the stuff we were told was value is worthless. It's toxic waste. It's speculative, debt-based monopoly money. We don't even have real money. That's waiting to default and blow up. So that's time bomb. That was built into the system. The system was designed to blow. Now, the purpose was always to get what's being proposed right now as this post-nation state system under the Davos crowd. But again, that's why I would say, when you look at what was always orchestrating this oligarchical institution, because before the era of globalization and before the era of the Cold War, it was better understood that society was organized by self-government or by empire, and it was better clearly defined, the parameters of the fight. So it got weaker and more confused since 1946 or so. But essentially, the empire system, whether it was French, Belgium, British, Dutch, whatever, the system of empire has certain, again, common characteristics, amongst which are, like I said, master-slave dichotomy of society, the idea that human beings that are born into the slave families are going to have to adhere to certain standards of bestial behavior and bestial thinking, where their senses are ultimately what shapes the behavior of their powers of mind. Their minds are not allowed to mature to love wisdom, such that the wisdom governs how you understand or use your senses, which is what a healthy, I think, integrated human being matures into normally. Not that's troublesome to the empire. So our senses, our hedonistic passions have to be the masters of our hearts and minds. As such, we can't really govern ourselves as individuals. We can't really know ourselves the way Plato proposes that human beings know thyself, right? Before you go into politics, you can't really do that. Just fix my camera here. You can't really do that if you're just believing every single thing the lower, everything below your belly is telling you to do. And you essentially become somebody who thinks you're free, but you're basically believing that the shadows cast on the cave wall of Plato's cave is what is real. And the shadow masters, those casting the shadows, are the ones who have the power. Those are sort of like the auxiliaries of the empire, the people who are used as managers or upper level managers of an empire. The last thing I would say is population control, because if you ultimately believe that human beings are that's our if we're just talking apes or talking cows, then just like apes and cows, there are limits to our existence, absolute limits, what one might call today carrying capacities that you have to abide by as if it was a law of the universe. And animals know when to regulate their population limits when they over exceed the quantity of their individual units of rabbits or squirrels that nature can provide. If there's a drought, the squirrels will eat the baby squirrels. They will die, and they'll re-regulate to the equilibrium of whatever system they happen to exist within. Human beings may or may not do that. If we're acting like squirrels, like or idiot talking cows on a feudal lord's plantation, sure, we might cannibalize ourselves, as even is being proposed right now by some think tanks around Davos. Or we might just start eating bugs before we cannibalize ourselves. Or we can be creative. You can turn useless eaters into useful creators, but that requires thinking about the whole thing very differently. So that's the other thing that the oligarchical or the globalist system has been working very hard to obstruct, is the destiny of humankind to become a species as a whole of wisdom that sees with the mind's eye and thus has access to creative powers and thus can act on future limits before they strike by making new discoveries into the laws of the universe, and willfully transforming our behavior to said universe in such a way that the universe responds by giving us a greater power of sustaining more people at a higher quality of life with higher mental access to mental powers without any intrinsic absolute limit. The limits are always relative to the discoveries we fail to make or that we do make. And the oligarchy says, no, the limits are absolute. The discoveries are always have to be controlled by the mathematical models we put into our Club of Rome computer models that assert that, whatever it is, 500 million, a billion is the carrying capacity of the earth, and all discoveries have to be channeled towards making sure our population accommodates those limits, whether through creativity in windmill technology, solar panel technology, new video game technology, or drugs, or whatever. That's the only kind of creativity that is permitted in the system. Any type of creativity that you saw from people like Da Vinci or Benjamin Franklin, no, that's all bad. That's forbidden. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot to unpack. I do, 100% agree with what you just said. But I notice when I try to explain globalism to other people, they get a little bit confused with the whole idea of if it's universal, if it's a one world thing, how can there be competing factions or how or they'll go superficial, or they'll go, okay, if it's coming out of America, then it's the Americans. But
Yeah.
I would say it's way more sophisticated than that. I would describe it as well as it being a like you said, as you call it, an oligarchical class that shares a worldview that transcends, as you said, nation states, and there's this one worldness about it. But at the same time, the oligarchical class is also international too, where they would they like the British branch, the American branch, the European branch, and they will also jockey for power amongst themselves, even though they share the same end goal, and
Yeah.
it could be a a a battle of which brand of totalitarianism is going to win out in the end.
Yeah.
And uh, and I noticed the globalists will always mainly reside where the power structure is the most powerful. Like, for example, it was the British Empire, but it wasn't really at one stage. It wasn't really the British though. The British people themselves were also suppressed by this thinking. So what you can't really blame the British, or it was the Soviet Union. I think communism was a brand of globalism of its day. And so it was there, but then when they collapsed, it went to America, and now America, and then everything was America, globalism and anti-Americanism, but it wasn't really the Americans either. They also have been kind of been trotted upon.
Mhm.
So
It's
it's hard to grasp
yeah.
exactly where they are, who they are, but that's their strength because they are everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, for the first part of your question, what I always hold on to in the back of my mind for those who try to treat world affairs from the standpoint of the fallacy of nations, that people say, oh, the US is trying to get a war with China right now, or Russia, or the US is done, or Russia has done this, and or Britain, is pushing for this. And it's like, that's a language which itself causes us to derail from the truth, because the truth is that nations do exist. It's a relatively new phenomenon in world history. They didn't really exist as entities before the 1648 Peace of Westphalia,
Mm.
ended the 30 years religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. Before that, it was international relations was defined primarily by the will of the stronger. It was a system of global empire for most of human history. That's what it's been. You had city states at some times. At some points, you had like leadership arise in certain city states in Europe, for example, in Florence, that was able to unleash something very good. You had other city states, like in the case of Venice, that called itself a republic, or Genoa, it's a junior partner. They were centers of a lot of destruction. But it's like, were the Venetians the like evil, even though a lot of evil was done in Venice geographically as the center of command for a very long time. It was the center for like 800 years of world finance, bullion trade, global maritime trade, especially after the destruction of Constantinople. Was that like was 14 that was 1451 that Constantinople got completely wiped, and Venice sort of took control of all of her maritime routes and became, but even before that, Venice was a center of very, very nefarious activities, let's just say, in a very polite way. And then afterwards, you had a transmigration of the oligarchical culture that had latched on like a parasite onto Venice. Things got a little bit fragile around the early part of the 1500s, and they had to figure out a different strategy. They couldn't remain as complacent with their power as they thought they could have before something happened in 1509, 1510, which almost wiped them off the map, which had a lot to do with something that Florence and especially Dante Alighieri had put into motion, and people like Machiavelli, Da Vinci, Cosimo de' Medici were organizing. Anyway, and I'm referring right now, for anybody listening confused, it's the League of Cambrai. That almost destroyed Venice. But essentially, the oligarchical power, the nest of power that had found themselves in Venice realized they needed a new strategy, and they focused increasingly on moving to a new host. And Venice became less. And you mentioned Webster Tarpley as somebody who influenced some of your research. He did some really great work in the early 80s into this history, and that really blew my mind. But he documents and clearly with original quotes from people like actual doges and ambassadors who were making this history happen. There was a motion of the Venetian oligarchy to transpose itself into first Amsterdam, which had formerly been a hotbed of creative anti-imperial activity. Science, arts were blossoming in Amsterdam, as well as a strong Republican freedom movement. This is what people like Rembrandt and earlier Peter Bruegel were leaders of. It was a cultural, political emancipation movement against the Habsburg Empire. It was a very strong movement. Schiller writes about this in his Don Carlos, which is a very strong piece of history research. Anyway, Amsterdam becomes now a center that's taking control of increasingly. The culture is debauched. It's turned into increasingly a speculative command zone where, the idea of economic warfare as it is practiced today in globalization was really honed in those days of the early Venetian takeover of Amsterdam. The creation of the Bank of Amsterdam was created. The Dutch East India Company was created, which eventually merged with Britain and the British East India Company around the same time as the Dutch bank. Private, the world's sort of first modern private central bank was created then in 1609, same time that the merging happened. And you had increasingly this what was for the first time in supranational corporations that had their own private mercenary force, their own private issuance of currency, their integration into the banking, into the government structures of both the Netherlands and increasingly Britain was taking hold. And it was only Britain was the trophy, though. Britain was the place, like England. England was the trophy because England had been the strongest, again, after the Netherlands. It was the strongest hotbed of creative anti-oligarchical fervor, and people like Thomas More, Erasmus, later on the Shakespeare network, including Marlowe, who might have been Shakespeare actually, and a wide array of statesmen, scientists, artists were integrated in working very closely to create a new type of culture that had never been permitted to blossom in human history. And Britain was a key place for that. So that was a zone which was very strategic. It was an island, right, far enough removed from the mainland of Europe. And it had a strong strategic hold on the world if you could take that. And they took that in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, which then set the stage for not only the destruction of many of the remnants of the strongest anti-imperial thinkers, but it created the basis for the Bank of England in 1695. And that Bank of England became, as it is today, the center of global finance with the City of London, right inside. It's the city within the city. And it has its own jurisdiction, its own police, its own laws. It has total autonomy, right? And that's the way that the world empire is able to this very day manage the world system through things like the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, the offshore accounts, the Micronesia. Like, you have an international network of zones affiliated, usually what you'll find with the British Commonwealth, that involves global narcotics, heroin, money laundering, terrorist financing, black ops, everything. This is demonstrably provable. And also things that involve like the modern rape of Africa. People think, oh, Africa went free after the 60s. No, that was never consolidated. And to this very day, something like 70% of the natural resources, oil, gas, coal, gold, diamonds, vital resources, there's a fight over rare earths of Africa. It's the richest continent, but 70% are controlled by companies that are based either directly in the UK or in the British Commonwealth, and the London Stock Exchange. So it's that type of empire. The Spider's Web is a good documentary that was recently produced, going through some elements of this in terms of the offshore Cayman Islands accounts to maintain whole nations. So, it's not nations, because if it was nations would have benefited. And if people say, oh, it's the American empire, it's like, well, the American people didn't benefit by what the American empire did, and the American nation didn't benefit by what the American empire did. America today is much weaker than it has ever been. So who benefited by the policies of the last 50, 60 years, right? After JFK was killed, especially. And that's where, it's always good to think, for people who are really stuck in this idea of, oh, it's this nation versus this one. It's like, well, why didn't this powerful nation you hate benefit? Why are there people weak and committing suicide? Why is their nation like on the verge of collapse if that was the case, right? So it's this other thing, and you can't define, like, I tend to find it troublesome to try to, like, there are some names of some of the leading families you can infer, you can get at, but it's less important. A lot of people, they obsess too much about, give me the names. And it's like, well, honestly, if it wasn't this name, it would be some other name, because the culture is so dumbed down and mediocratized that you guys would fall for, by you guys, I mean, the mass majority of the people would fall for whatever type of crap is sold to them using a certain technique of persuasion, because they don't love truth enough. So if it wasn't that name, it'd be another name. You got to look at more like, well, what's the nature of the system? What does it do? And what are its weaknesses? What has weakened it in the past, so that we can better look at, well, what is it afraid of today? What are its weak points today, right? And then you can kind of get somewhere more constructive.
Yeah, having said that, I also think there's also, I suppose, red herrings given out to the people that may be on the right track, but then they kind of direct them somewhere else where they end up chasing the tail. Like, like for example, globalism and the whole, system of banking cartels and all that. For example, I researched a bit of the early history of the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Labor Movement, and there was a book called The Kingdom of Shylock, and it was a major book printed in the early 1900s, and I read it myself. It's at the State Library, and it sounds like it's describing modern day globalism, like considering it was written back then, but unfortunately, it had the twist of going into the anti-Semitic Jewish world conspiracy that the Jews are really kind of running it. So it was almost as if they were describing what was happening, but then they add that little bit in, and it kind of either discredits it, or at the time that was very much in vogue, that type of thinking. It kind of you kind of ruin it for you. You've ruined it for yourself in a way. Like you were almost there, and then no, they add that bit in there, and now the whole thing's garbage. But I think that's a lot. It's the Jews, or it's the aliens, the lizard people, or it's the whatever else you can think of, and fortunately that's there too as well. So when you try to explain it to people, they might latch on to that or be familiar with those things, and they go, oh, you believe in the lizard people. That sounds like you're talking about the lizard people, but no, like forget about that. But I think that was a technique that was even employed back in the day as well. It's not a modern day thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a tried and proven technique, because there will always be people who will think outside the box, always, and especially when you're building your empire on lies, you got to presume that there's an acceptable rate in the mind of like a grand strategist, an acceptable or an expected rate of your target audience who will want to get out of the cage you want to get them to think to embrace. And they will think critically about the paradoxes that break down when an official narrative that they're supposed to believe in breaks down with evidence that their minds can see. So the question then is, well, can you create enough can you control the rest of their journey? Can you create nets when one fish wants to bounce outside of its pool? Can you create as many nets as possible, depending on which direction that fish is going to jump out of it, to catch them and give them a false sense of discoveries, to direct how they make those discoveries into the reality that there are that there is a continuity of oligarchical intentions in some way manipulating them. And so you could read David Icke and find that 90% of what he's saying is valid and verifiable, but it's the 10% of the kooky stuff that is of the highest value for the oligarchy, which discredits the 90%. It's like
exactly.
pooping in the punch bowl, as some people have said. Nobody wants to. It doesn't mean the punch wasn't good. Don't say that punch is thus bad. It's that you have poop in there. Somebody pooped in it. So the baby gets
now. Yeah.
So the Jews, they've been an easy scapegoat for hundreds of years. I would say this goes back to the original. There's a lot of this from the Rothschild conspiracy stuff, or the Sassoons. Like, these are all families that have been put into power, and they're sort of what you might call dynastic mercenaries. They're families that have Jewish names. They're as willing to kill Jews as they are to kill Africans or anybody else. They're not animated by anything, religious inside of them, except for maybe the fact that they're satanic, or that, that they're obedient to their masters who are satanic. And they're allowed certain privileges, and they, people like Amschel Rothschild back in the 1750s did, demonstrated a certain skill set, a certain lack of care of his conscience, and carried out works that were assigned to him very well. And in return, he was rewarded with influence. He was elevated to a stature of having more responsibilities, and that he carried out so well that his family, his kids, were granted a certain, set of privileges as well, as long as they maintain the continuity of the obedience of being mercenaries. And part of the consequence of when you grant, there's an oft quoted, but I think a deceitful term used by, I forget which Rothschild, that's often quoted from the 1880s or so. Might have been a Victor, I don't know. That I care not who makes a nation's laws if you give me control of their money. That's actually a half truth, because the oligarchy doesn't care so much about who controls the money. They care more about who controls the system in which the money operates. Because the money, if you control trillions of dollars and you're willing to eliminate 90% of your money to maintain your power or to increase your power, as we see with today, right? Like, look, today we got what, $1.2 quadrillion of nominal value built into the system of derivatives and speculative assets that have been built up into the system for the past 20 plus years. It's going to be wiped out. It's designed to be erased, to be reset. The people who have a lot of money are going to have less money, but under the idea of the, shareholder capitalism logic, stakeholder capitalism logic, that less money is going to still accompany much greater power and influence over the slaves. So who will own nothing and they'll somehow be happy because you own the physical things, though you have less money. So the thing is, who's controlling the system? Whether it's a pro-industrial, pro-growth system or a system premised on the worshiping of money or something else, right? Or the increase of debts while the real values of society are decreased. That's really where it is. And going back to, I think, originally Khazaria is a place where people infer that there's always something subhuman, whether it's the aliens thing, the lizards, whatever, the Jews. If you look at the way that the Jews are framed in the Protocols of Zion, which itself is a forgery written by somebody affiliated with the Russian Okhrana, the French branch of the Russian Okhrana, who was in charge of counter gang operations in France. Because just like today, international terrorism was still operated via intelligence agencies. British, Okhrana, which is the Russian secret intelligence, were integrated, building up anarchist and deploying anarchist, assassins, bomb makers, things like that, to carry out the dismantling of nation states, the killing of statesmen like McKinley or Alexander II, or a whole bunch. So that's what it was in the late 19th century, and that's when the protocols were created. But if you read these things, and I've read them, and anybody can read them, it reads like a cartoon. It's like there's a lack of cultural sophistication in our society such that people read these things, and because they're used to Hollywood, very simplified good guys versus bad guys in Bruce Willis movies, they read that and they're like, oh yeah, look, the Jews say that they want a global Jewish order and they want to wipe out the goyim, and it's like evil is more sophisticated than that. This is like baby Lala talking. Like, this is not how actual evil that's capable of organizing itself this way ever would speak. It never act. There is evil, but that's not how it communicates unto itself.
I always thought that the protocols came about during the Russian Civil War with the Bolsheviks, and it was the White Army that wanted to kind of use it to demonize the communists. And
It came about a little bit earlier, before 1905. I think it was like 1903 or so, because the 1905 was the first attempt at overthrowing the Tsars, Tsar Nicholas II.
Yeah,
And it failed. It failed, but it was a big mess. And part of that was to persuade the people that the state was run by Jews, but it was more, the protocols were more targeted at the elites, at convincing the more malleable elites, especially people like Tsar Nicholas II, that those who wished to make policy, especially economic policy, like the figure of Count Sergei Witte was a very important positive figure. He was like the Abraham Lincoln force of Russia, who was the finance minister, transport minister, who organized bringing in the American system of protectionism, state banking, sort of like a Russian version of the greenbacks in the 1890s. And he was working with colleagues in Japan, in China. He was working with Otto von Bismarck at maintaining alliances, keeping things like World War I from happening by working through diplomatic channels. But also the key was national banking, building great projects, and making the money system behave according to the interests of the nation state and its people. And so he was a big factor and a force around Russia for a long time. And the protocols were very much used by the handlers, who were, like the flatterers positioned around Nicholas II. Like, his wife was a big one, who was a British progeny of Queen Victoria, and a bunch of other ass-kissing, flattering advisors who were basically trying to convince them that no, Witte is a Rothschild stooge. Look, the Rothschilds have this plan to take over the world and destroy Russia, and so that's what Witte is. He's trying to steal Russia away from you and steal your spotlight. And you had similar people in Germany in the network of the state, the elites, who were also being swayed by this. People like Hitler was a big believer that, there really was a Jewish conspiracy, and the protocols were like gospel, and many others were like that. Henry Ford really believed that was true. Henry Ford, I don't think he was a bad guy originally. And I mean, he really loved progress, and he really wanted to, create an economic system with morality at its heart. But he really, really, really believed the protocols of Zion, and became, in consequence, somebody who supported fascism as a solution, and hardcore anti-Semitism to crush the Zionist plague, or basically Judaism as a whole, which he saw as satanic. So it had as many of these things do, it had a multiple set of target audiences for different reasons. But the big audience was the so-called elite, and the battle that was occurring within the elites at that time. And it really blew up over the Bolshevik period.
Okay. Going on to America now. For me, America really was for the longest time, one of the major, I suppose, counter forces against, I suppose, globalism of its day, and even now to a certain point. But I think you touched upon it, but I was hoping you could go a little bit more in depth. Basically, could you explain exactly the purpose of America? Why was it such a threat, especially at the beginning with the founders, and then the whole when you reach into the Civil War period and the idea of the British Empire kind of hoping to regain the American Republic and take it back into its empire, and the whole I suppose not secret history, but um, um, unknown history of the whole relationship between Tsarist Russia and the Lincoln government, and
Yeah,
and how World War One could have erupted back then,
easily.
but
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating, and a lot of people don't know that. And when I say that to people, how Lincoln and Tsar Nicholas the First, who would think,
Lincoln
um,
was Alexander II was
Alexander
Lincoln.
II. Yeah, sorry. They were trying to get rid of serfdom and slavery around the same time, and I think Russia really could be another America. They have such the landmass and the resources and the people and everything like that. But it's amazing. Most of its time, America and Russia has been placed in conflict to one another. I believe artificially so, because if those two ever got on the same page and be a force for good, I mean, I think it'd be game over for globalism.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
uh, that's where you go into Anthony Sattin's work and the whole, the monopolist capitalists of Wall Street supporting communism and bailing it out back in its early days after Lenin's revolution. There's so much there. Um,
hmm
so I was wondering if you could take some time and talk about America and talk about its role in the world and
yeah, sure.
the whole clash of two Americas. How there's almost like
Yeah,
two two competing uh, versions of America, always trying to kind of jockey for control
yeah,
within itself.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
so it's complicated, but it's fascinating. So please, can you go into that bit?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and, I think it's useful to think of a nation, a multi-generational process, like a nation with its character, and nations are obviously, they all have different characters. It's not black and white, and it's kind of like a person. We all have, we have things that we've done that we're proud of. We've things that we've done in our past that we're ashamed of. We wish we could have done better. We wish we'd have made different choices, and every person, until the very day you die, you're sort of an unfinished. There's always opportunity to change, and when sometimes we get into bad habits, it becomes more difficult to change for the good. And I think most people have some experience of that, whether they're wrestling with that now or whether they've gone through experiences of smoking or other habits, whatever it is. The brain gets into a bad way, you get into an addiction of some sort or another, and it becomes harder and harder to get back on the wise path, right? Not that you don't want to, but it becomes harder. And sometimes people cope by just pretending that the good path isn't there. They just ignore the conscience. It doesn't mean their conscience ceases to exist, but they choose to cut themselves off as much as they can just to be functional, because they lose a sense of belief that they could be otherwise, that they could get back to becoming somebody that they're proud of. And that's sad. It's tragic when that happens, and it's really tragic when that happens with somebody who has political power. And it's really beautiful when somebody who was on the wrong path is able to transform and become good. And I think that in our cynical society, we're very much immersed in a culture that reinforces the idea that human beings are corrupt. We can all believe very easily that good people can become corrupt, but it's very difficult for people to think about how people who were doing corrupt things can become good. But it's only by understanding both that you can get a sense of history. And the United States is definitely, you could learn a lot from from this way of thinking about the United States. Now, the United States did not survive 250 years by being simply an empire out suppressing the weak and running regime change operations to keep the world down. That's not how it survived. And in fact, that was, for most of that last 250 years and even 400 years, it's been typically the British Empire that was the empire doing that. And as we alluded to earlier in our discussion, it wasn't even the British people and it wasn't the British nation. It was this other thing that latched onto Britain as a control zone to carry out insidious operations which accompanied the growth of cultural processes that would encourage your victims to become corrupt, so that as they were corrupted, they would be less able to fight you off or defend themselves. That's part of the tool basket of empire. It's an art or a science, you could say, of corruption, of finding somebody's weakness and feeding their weakness. Look at where their hunger is, feed it, and make them then addicted to it, so that they're then beholden to who's feeding them. And they're also compromised. So if they do get a conscience and they want at some point to step out of line, you've always got their weakness that you filmed or whatever, right, that you can hold over their heads. So the U.S. originally emerged when you read the writings of many of those who founding fathers of the United States, and I would say especially Benjamin Franklin, and look at, well, what was animating their hearts and minds? What was their grand strategy? Why did they call, when it was still just 13 colonies declaring independence, why did they call it the Continental Congress, the Continental Army? They obviously had a bigger vision, despite the fact that 90% of the continent was run by, the British, the French empires, the Spanish empires, and the Russian empires. That was most of North America. And then you had the 13 colonies. So there was a much grander design. And if you look at how did it happen, it couldn't have happened were it not for, one, Benjamin Franklin's prestige as having been somebody who was able to make a discovery that none of the great minds, the arrogant, great educated minds of Europe were able to make in terms of the nature of electricity and lightning, which in Ben Franklin's mind was always interconnected with his overarching understanding of natural law, not just in physics, but in the moral law, in political freedom. It was always two sides of the same thing, but he won over a big chunk of supporters that he was able to transform from amongst the elite and the scientists and the statesmen of Europe, as well as of India and other countries. And they called him the Prometheus of America. This guy with a grade 3 education, not born from a royal family, was able to make a great discovery, and one which had powers of increasing our ability to have dominion over nature, right? Lightning rods, other forms of inventions, and an entire basis of a way of thinking about economy emerged, which is Ben Franklin was actually an economist. People don't know that. He refuted the depopulation agenda in his observations on the increase of mankind in 1851. He was one of the driving forces of creating a paper currency founded upon the investments into manufacturing in his necessities of a paper script. He printed it in his printing houses. He was printing the Philadelphia paper money systems. And it was all tied to an idea that money was not a value unto itself because people wanted it. That's what the British say, but that's not reality. The reality is that money is something which is an invention, a creation that humans make to facilitate the growth of the productive powers of labor, the growth of manufacturing, the growth of new inventions, which is why he was also a driving force behind like the creation of patents, so that every citizen who has a good idea could create also a financial incentive to their good ideas. It doesn't mean you should patent life the way Monsanto does, but it's based on the idea that the mind is the source of the value. And when you bring people into a state of harmony with the general welfare of their nation, it's because you're encouraging the nation to both increase the quality of life of all people, but also incorporate the good ideas of the people that participate in the overarching evolution and survival of the society that goes on beyond their lifetimes. So Ben Franklin had this whole thing. So how did that succeed? As like the biggest army of the world, the British Empire, being defeated by these like farmers? Well, you had to get, German, Prussian, Polish, Irish leading generals, military men, scientists, Marquis de Lafayette from France. Ben Franklin organized the French government to support the cause of the Americans in 1777. That was the American-French Treaty, or 78. Russia, Ben Franklin became a member. He organized the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Ekaterina Dashkova, also an incredible 32-year-old woman reformer, president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who then made Ben Franklin. So he became a member of that, and she became the first Russian member of his philosophical society, which had international networks. He organized through his French contacts, many of whom were, again, the scientist statesman thing was much more common. The greatest, leader of the French Revolution early on, who ended up getting his head cut off, was Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who was known as the Ben Franklin of France. He was the president of the L'Assemblée, who organized the tennis court oath. But through these French contacts, he was able to organize Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the Muslim revolutionaries of India, southern India, in the Mysore region, to fight the British and declare independence in 1779. And in 1780, they fully launched in, and Tipu Sultan was writing letters to the Continental Congress saying, our fight is your fight. And they absorbed 20% of the British Navy to have to fight the Indians, who understood that. And when you read these letters from Tipu Sultan, that there was a new age of reason and brotherhood that had nothing to do, that transcended religious differences. These were Muslims working with, the Christian world, everybody. And Sidi Muhammad of Morocco, the Emperor of Morocco, was keeping all of the American ships safe from Barbary pirates who were deployed and working closely with the British East India Company to destroy American ships. Morocco was the first nation in the world under Sidi Muhammad to recognize American independence in 1777. The United States was the first battleship that was part of the American Navy. It was called the Hyder Ali, based on the revolutionary father of Tipu Sultan, again, a Muslim, right? And it carried out many battles with the British. So, you've got this process where there was a whole understanding that we were on the cusp of a new breakthrough for the species, that the species would finally break away from becoming an oligarchical sort of, plaything, talking cows to be controlled by a master class. And instead we would have an age not by hereditary power, but the consent of the governed, and the idea of the inalienable rights of all people being what defines international law, national law, everything. And that was subverted. Unfortunately, the US didn't consolidate its ideals. There were fifth columnists, what we today call deep state operations, embedded still within the young America in its early days. This is what killed Alexander Hamilton. This is what set up Wall Street by Aaron Burr and the maneuver he did, stealing public money to create the Bank of Manhattan in 1798. This is what's been there the whole time, as the Eastern establishment banking families, the Cushings, there's a whole network that ran the opium trade with the British, starting in the early 1800s. And this is what killed Lincoln. This is what killed, before Lincoln, it killed Zachary Taylor and Harrison. This is what killed the National Bank under Jackson in 1836. It's what killed later on JFK. And it's deeply embedded in Canada. That's a key control center. You have a big chunk of it that's in the United States. And it's not American, it's not really Canadian as such, it's something else. And that's the thing. So that's what's been there the whole time. That's what I believe, that there was this better America that was reactivated when Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. And personally, I thought that it had been extinguished after Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968. I didn't think personally that there was a powerful enough nationalist patriotic dynamic that still existed at this late stage of the rot. And I was shocked. I was surprised that it was able to organize itself in such a manner that Hillary was able to lose. You got a nationalist outsider who was brought in, who had his problems, but definitely didn't play according to the script that was being expected of him, which was great. And so, it's given us, I think, a certain amount of, it bought us time. And the oligarchy has been scrambling to reconsolidate their power in the United States after they lost 4 years of their planning. And, nations of Eurasia, especially, which has done a much better job of weeding their deep state gardens than we have been able to take that time and really organize something that is premised on a viable alternative political economic system, which can actually float. Again, there's problems with everything. There's nothing that is pure. There's no pure nation state that's crystallized in this world, but they've actually put online, knowing that the current system in the West it's set to blow. They've spent the last few years building up something much, much more viable and premised on a certain competency in banking, in long-term credit emissions for big projects, a certain open system approach to thinking instead of thinking about population control. There's a pro-industrial growth orientation. All very good. Those are good things you can work with. So we're at that point. That's where we're at right now.
Yeah, there are certain moments in history where I think we hit the crossroads, and I think the American Revolution was one of them. But unfortunately, the French Revolution shortly after was I think originally set to be like another American Revolution, but it quickly got I suppose usurped by the Jacobins, the communists of the day, the Bolsheviks of their time. What happened there exactly? Why, and especially France supported the American Revolution. How come it couldn't do it themselves?
Well, I found that the research of Pierre Baudry I found to be very useful. Which this is a chapter in my volume 1 of the Untold History of Canada. I also teamed up with an excellent filmmaker who's made this into a little mini set of micro videos, little mini documentaries, which are now released as of this week.
Oh.
I'll send them to you. They're really fun. And no, in short form, it's cultural, as the United States had a much more advanced, developed cultural process going, such that it was very common to have what's called the Latin farmer. There was an educational process much more normalized for many decades in America, in the 13 colonies, that encouraged Latin, Greek, the study of the Bible, the reading of the classics amongst the farming population. And in France, unfortunately, there was a very different, more poisonous cultural norm that prevented the popularization of literacy and reading from most of the people, most of the masses. And honestly, if you're going to put your life on the line as a citizen, and not just a subject waiting for the state to provide for you, but if you're going to be like a citizen, meaning you're willing to die for your nation, and that means your nation has to be worth your dying for, right? Like it's a reciprocal thing. But that means, like, there's an idea, you have to have a very strong idea of sovereignty, of freedom, of liberty, of what is this, which means you have to have worked on those ideas. You have to have read those pamphlets. You have to have read the philosophical treaties to think through, why is my life worth dying for freedom? And so in the case of France, the psycho-spiritual infrastructure, I don't think, was really there. It was lacking. And the seigneurie system, the feudal system didn't allow it. So there was a lot more people moving for hunger. They had been abused, they had been starved by America didn't have a deep-seated oligarchical system that was indigenous. It was the British Empire. France had a very multi-centuries long, oligarchical system of aristocrats who had become very, not all, but most, had become very over-bloated, you were right, with their comfort, and they lacked any sense of care for the people. So the people felt a resentment, justifiably. And the good people, the best aristocrats, people like Marquis de Lafayette, who did love the people, and the great scientists like Lavoisier, the great chemist, who really did love the people a lot. Like they loved the potential, because they were looking at people from the standpoint of the potential of what you could be if you could just get rid of these artificial constraints, right, of this outdated empire system. You could, they saw this beautiful world of harmony and brotherhood and win-win cooperation. And so they unfortunately didn't have much that much to work with. So after the first 6 months, which started off pretty good, you had the tennis court oath, you had the Declaration of the Inalienable Rights of Man, but the population, there had already been a counter gang operation to weaponize the beaten down masses. People like Robespierre, Danton, Marat, others who had been organizing the Jacobin movement were more demagogues. There were people who were rabble rousers who were willing to channel the mob think, the mob energy into just destruction of the state, which became associated with all that is evil. Despite the fact that no, there's actually nuance, there's good and evil, and you want to work with the good. Don't kill the good, as they ended up doing. Part of the manipulation was Britain was able to organize through free trade agreements certain deals that ensured that France lost all of its grain reserves. So back in like 1784, 85, they finalized the British-French Free Trade Agreement. And that involved, with that agreement, just like they did in Ireland or in India, they basically said, well, you signed the agreement, so there's a demand in Britain that you have to fulfill according to these contracts. And so Britain had first dibs to buy the French food over the French. The French they begged the British to just let us buy. We'll pay more than market value. Just let us buy it back. And Britain had a meeting with the House of Lords, and there was a famine going on. There was a drought, or I think it was a hailstorm or something, but it basically wiped out much of the French agriculture. So they only had the reserves, and Britain came back after their meeting with the House of Lords and said, no, sorry, you got to send it to us. And they did. And people like the Duke of Orleans was a key figure in this, Philippe Égalité. And so, that also helped starve the people. So when you got a climate, kind of like what they did with the Maidan color revolutions of the current day, you create economic despair, you destroy the people economically. And then by doing that and creating such scarcity, now they're more radicalizable. Now they're more willing to like blow things up because they lose their heads when their families are starving. If there's abundance, really hard to weaponize or radicalize the people, which is also part of, I think, what the danger of creating global scarcity right now is sort of creating a situation of, there's a lot of intelligence operations that have set the stage for blaming the Jews, blaming some other group, right, that would be then targeted. So that's part of what we have to be aware of, is these historical precedents of how this sort of thing is used. This is how this was used again with the Bolshevik Revolution, which I will just say one thing. In looking into the Bolshevik Revolution, there are good people and bad people within the Bolsheviks too, right? Like I would say the worst of the worst was Trotsky and Jabotinsky, and also Parvus. Interestingly enough, Jabotinsky went on to create the foundation of modern, Greater Israel. Parvus went on to create the entire Young Turk movement. He was the leader of the Young Turks, all Freemasonic networks. And Trotsky ended up creating a whole bunch of mutants like the neoconservative movement, and many other things, even within Russia, that took over when at the moment Stalin died. The Trotskyite sleepers all took back control, and that became what animated Russia from 1955 onward until the collapse in 91. Was essentially a pseudo Trotsky network of cells that anyway, it gets messy, but all that to say, people are generally problem solvers, and you'll find that people will take whatever they have given to them. If they have an orientation towards their humanness, they will work, and you'll get people who are socialists who will do really good things, and then you'll get people who are detached from their humanness, and they will take socialism and then use it the way you got the Fabian Society and these creeps at Davos using it, as a way to just attract people to their honey, which is hiding poison. Same thing for capitalism, right? You got good capitalists who really want to help people and create capital, and then you got bad capitalists that want to just hide feudalism and destroy capital. So yeah.
Staying on with, I suppose, with the Civil War era, I know you go into depth into that particular point in history. Could you talk a little bit of that time of Lincoln, of the Civil War, what it could have been, the post post-Civil War era, and guys like Teddy Roosevelt coming
Mm,
coming up, death of McKinley, and things like that.
yeah, yeah, that's an important period of history, and this is for people who want to dig more into it. The end of volume 1 and the beginning of volume 2 of my Clash of the Two Americas goes through a bit of a journey there in a lot of this. But in short, the Civil War couldn't really be thought of as the Second American Revolution.
Mm.
It was the attempt to finally consolidate what was not finished in 1780 or 1783, when the Peace of Paris was signed, and that dealt with the issue of slavery. And I mean, people say, oh, Lincoln just wanted to preserve the Union, he didn't care about slavery, and it's like, that's a lot of things taken out of context for that. He said, sure enough, that yeah, if I could preserve the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it, and if I could free slaves and preserve the Union, I would do that. Now, part of what his strategy was, and he's attacking slavery since he's a young lawyer from Illinois in the 1830s, working with John Quincy Adams, a leading anti-slave fighter. The whole Amistad case was defended by John Quincy Adams. He was a early patron of Lincoln, and together they worked together to try to get, and they did get President Harrison elected in 1840, who died 3 months later with a bill to activate a third national bank after Jackson had killed it, creating a whole network of basically he empowered the slave power to a degree never before seen, and he turned the U.S. into a giant speculative, deregulated free trade basket case with bank panics periodically, splattered over every few years. And so Lincoln had been a lifelong anti-slave, pro-national system of economic proponent and leader. And when the U.S. finally came to a breaking point, Lincoln was organized, or he organized himself to enter the stage of history, and he understood that you couldn't free slaves if you let the South declare its own pro-British Confederacy based on it's based on a slave system. Like the Confederate Constitution, if you read what Jefferson Davis was proposing the Constitution be that was ratified by the Confederate Congress. It says in Article 1 that no slave shall ever be permitted to go free as part of the Confederate nation. That was like for number 1. And it's also the banning of national credit for development of infrastructure industries was also banned. The role of the nation or national banks was banned. The role of protectionism was banned. It was insane. Like the only way you're going to be able to seriously eliminate slavery in the real world is if you have education and industry whereby machines can do the work of a lot of people, and people then have to be more knowledgeable and culturally advanced to operate advanced machinery and then improve upon that machinery. That takes much more education. You can't just go straight from elementary school to picking cotton anymore, or just skip elementary. So this is what was being threatened and with breaking away. Now in the North, Lincoln also had to contend with a pro-British a counter gang operation against the pro-slave network, which was most of the abolitionists, not all, but a big chunk of the leading abolitionists, especially Garrison was a big one, who were themselves just simply saying, yeah, okay, we should just avoid war at all costs and let the southern the slave states have their own society, and we'll have our own no slave society, but we're going to abolish the Constitution, which they say is a slave constitution, and we're going to have our own special relationship with the British. The South will have their special relationship with the British. And the whole thing's a fraud because, Frederick Douglass, the slave who freed himself and broke with the abolitionists to work with Lincoln, he was wise. And he said at a certain point in his autobiography, like, I ended up reading one day, I was like, I've never read the Constitution. And I read it finally after polemicizing against it for years under Garrison, Lloyd Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison. And I realized that it doesn't endorse slavery at all anywhere in it. It's, if anything, an anti-slave document. And he understood Lincoln's strategy at that point, that if you're going to extinguish slavery, and also that means empire, because Lincoln understood slavery and global empire to be two sides of the same thing, and he said so repeatedly in his speeches, you have to preserve the Union. The Union is the best expression, the most advanced expression of self-organized humankind, with a banking system to accompany the political ideals that, if used, cannot just end slavery, but bring about an end of empire by creating a new type of system of cooperation amongst cooperating nations, like John Quincy Adams envisioned, of a community of sovereign nation states, a community of principle. That was Quincy Adams' foreign policy doctrine. So this is what Lincoln understood, and this is what he was trying to put into motion. It required certain things to succeed that did not after he was assassinated through British, again, operations in Canada, which directed his assassination. That's where John Wilkes Booth was deployed. And the entire idea of industrializing the South through Reconstruction was subverted. The slave power was granted back their political power. And within a very short period, that became the basis of the KKK, Jim Crow laws, the stuff that Martin Luther King Jr. later on, a century later, was fighting against. And you're like, why was Martin Luther King having to fight that fight a century after, places like South Carolina had something like 11 black state senators elected in the 1870s? How did that happen? Now Carolina you can even vote as a black person, by the time Martin Luther King was coming. So what the hell happened, right? And it's because there's this entire, British fifth column destroying and dismantling, and also disrupting the things like the flow of Russian-U.S. relations, and looking at all of the grand strategy occurring in the 1870s, 80s, even 90s, their plan was to extend Lincoln's transcontinental railway all the way through Alaska and into Eurasia, connecting to what became the Trans-Siberian Railway, built by Count Sergei Witte as the spearhead, who was a guy who followed Lincoln's economics, who translated American system economists like Friedrich List into Russian, and was working again with Otto von Bismarck, and, like I said, Sadi Carnot of France, the assassinated French president who was killed in 1895, and many other allies in Asia, to build a network of nations that had full spectrum economies, could stand on their own 2 feet, and could work with each other to build mutual development projects, especially around rail and interconnectivity on transport corridors. That was where we were moving. And you can see the designs. There's graphs, maps that were made, engineering feasibility studies to connect the old and new worlds through the Bering Strait, like people like William Gilpin, first governor of Colorado and Lincoln's bodyguard, who was a leading global advocate of this. Nicholas II, who was killed later on, but he sponsored American engineers in 1906 to come to Russia to do the feasibility studies on the Russian side. So you had this whole momentum, and it was really just through the oligarchy having essentially a what you might call a temper tantrum, realizing that they lost the game. If they played by the rules of the game that they themselves had created, they couldn't win. The nation states of the world were getting too powerful, and that's where you had essentially the game board being kicked over, and that involves dozens of leading statesmen assassinated by proxies, terrorist proxies. Anarchists usually were the conduits to carry out these murders, including up to McKinley. Garfield was another one. There again, so many others. And then a bunch of wars, first between Japan, as Japan was increasingly captured by British foreign interests, British agents who had nested and put flatterers around the emperor of Japan. And he pushed away a lot of the better trustworthy advisors that he had, who were trying to keep him on the Lincoln path of national development. So that, this emperor was easily turned into a bit of a paranoid freak and got delusions of grandeur with the British, saying, we'll help you as a fellow island country destined to rule the inferior people of the world. We island people have to sit together. We island empires, and the empire bought it, and he took the British gifts, of money, of weapons, of warships, and he started wars with with China, and then later on with Russia, destroying the Russian fleet. And that set the stage again for other things. The Turks, the weakening Ottoman Empire, were organized by a bunch of Freemasons in the 1908, 09, 10 to build up toward the Balkan Wars that sucked in Russia, really did a number on Russia when it was already getting very weakened. This all set the stage for what became World War I as another completely artificial war that had no purpose. No one today could explain why World War I happened. There's no good reason. But it became a 4-year meat grinder, and it was basically just that. You create a British-controlled terrorist cell called the Black Hand in Serbia that is deployed to kill off a disposable lower-level oligarch or aristocrat in Austria, and that there's these secret military agreements between Serbia and Russia and Austria and Germany, or bigger Germany, and they'd already set the stage of the Entente Cordiale between Russia, France, and Britain. So the stage was already set. It was kind of like a precursor to Article 5 of NATO. Where one person gets in a war, everyone has to jump in.
All right.
So they said that's sort of what we're a template of what they're setting up right now, but now with nuclear bombs.
Fantastic. Okay. Could you go into a little bit more into the relationship of Tsarist Russia and the linking North American government? Because from my understanding of that piece of history, it was the British Empire that wanted to recapture the United States, and I think they even recognized the Confederacy as the legitimate government, and I think even the Tsar even sent 2 fleets to, I think, San Francisco and New York. And they were saying, if basically sending a message to the British going, if you basically interfere with this civil war, we'll jump in. And then everything, World War One could have happened then in the 1800s. And it would have been Tsarist Russia and America on the same side. I think my interpretation of history is I don't think the British really forgave Russia for that, and they ended up, I suppose, sending in and supporting communism to kind of destroy and punish Russia for that interference. That's a real simplified explanation of my analysis, but do you agree with that? Does that add up to your own research, and can you go into detail in that side of things?
Yeah, sure. In some ways, you wonder sometimes, right? Would the world have been better if they just got that World War, if they just went to war with Britain back then?
Yeah.
And also that would have been also Britain and France. Maybe that would have been a fight that would have, we'll never know the answer to that question, I guess. But the Britain, the thing that kept them from, I think, going into a hot war at the time, which they came so close, was that they had overextended themselves, and they were essentially, they had nearly bankrupted themselves over several years. They were in the midst of still waging, in 1860, the Opium War, the Second Opium War, was still running. That was a 4-year, very expensive war with China. There was a 2-year battle with the Indians to suppress constant Indian uprisings. That was a 2-year long process. Millions of Indians died in that process. That was, again, 1858. That process really began in earnest. So that was a huge expenditure, and they had worked really hard to getting the Crimean War going earlier with Russia, sucking Russia into that 4-year war of attrition, with the help of the French and some corrupt Ottomans. And the Ottoman Empire was getting pretty weak, and there was a faction, just like you have the 2 Americas, you have the two Russians, or Russias. And, you had a faction of more imperial-minded Third Rome Russians who were like, okay, we have to expand our territory to fulfill the ideals that the Roman Empire failed to achieve, of essentially global dominion. And so the territory of the Ottoman zone was like a easy pickings. They thought, the Ottomans were getting weakened and weakened. They were not modernizing. And so they got sucked into the spider's web. The whole trap was set already, though, and that was a really embarrassing. Russia was bankrupt. Really humiliating defeat. But that defeat came at a cost. Even like Britain didn't get a lot of spoils out of it. They just got to weaken Russia. So Britain was really beat. They put a lot of effort into providing warships for the Confederate South. They provided money, logistics, other things to organize the Confederate breakaway. So they had their hands everywhere in the world, disturbing things, lighting fires. So they didn't have the resources necessarily to jump in a war with both Russia and the United States. If it was just the United States, yeah, because the US was fighting a civil war, it was weaker. So when Russia came in, like Russia had already been working with the United States. I mean, the first rail line in Russia, we can't forget, was built between St. Petersburg and Moscow in the 1840s by a fellow named George Washington Whistler, an American, who was the brother of the Whistler, the painter. And he was a leading engineer brought in. He organized a whole grand strategy for Russian rail development, taking the best of Russia, Russian culture, and including some of the best of what America could offer. And it was a really great relationship. And the idea was, this is the better industrial Russians who were not part of the Third Rome faction were like, okay, if we're going to be able to finally have a modern society, we can get rid of serfdom, which means we need industrial development, which means the serfs have to have education. So we have to have a long-term, it's going to take time. Same type of problem Lincoln encountered. You can't just let the slaves free just like that. It's not so easy, because it's like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to have like now 4 million people just on the dole who've only been picking cotton their whole lives, and many of whom can't read. Like, what are you going to do? You need to have jobs. You need to have a growth strategy so that you can incorporate and use these people's skills and give them new skills. That was the same problem for Russia. And that's what Alexander II was facing. So when Alexander II came into power at the end of the Crimean War, he came in with Duke Constantine, his brother, Muraviev, leading I think he was the foreign minister. A whole network of really strong, good statesmen came in with him who had a good understanding of the need to transform Russia, get rid of the oligarchical corruption of the aristocracy, and reform in that sort of way that Lincoln was doing. That's why they, Alexander II freed the serfs, rightfully so. 25 million serfs freed, right? And that required then building rail, applying protective tariffs the way Lincoln did, the way America did since the very early days. And when it became clear that the U.S. might collapse under the Civil War, and there was wind or information that the British and the French, who had major possessions in Canada, the British had installed, I think, 10,000 British troops in Canada, ready to attack from the north. The French had a lot of soldiers under Maximilian in Mexico, ready to attack from the south and provide open support. I don't know if they had openly recognized the Confederacy as its own nation at that time. Not sure. But certainly it was understood that they were going to go in with a full-blown open backing in war, which would mean they did. At that point, they certainly would have recognized the Confederate South. And they had already been helping, like I said, the Confederacy by supplying warships like the SS Alabama, which destroyed like 90 Union boats. And they provided, the Confederacy with basing operations in Montreal and Toronto and Halifax, which did terrorist activities, the Albany raids, hundreds of other attacks from the north. The entire time Lincoln was fighting in the South. We're not told about that stuff in school. So largely due to the Russians, America survived. Also, the greenbacks helped a hell of a lot. The emission of state-backed credit through the Treasury, not through any private banks that were tied to building big projects. Russia's statesmen over the ensuing 20, 30 years came periodically to the US. Americans deployed themselves to Russia to help build the Trans-Siberian Railway. Dmitry Mendeleev, who worked closely with Count Witte, came to the US in 1876 at the Centennial Exhibition with a whole delegation of hundreds of Russians. And he went back to Russia, and this is the scientist, right, who discovered the periodic table of elements. was sort of like a Ben Franklin character of Russia in many ways, and he became the chairman of the Committee of the Protective Tariff of Russia, and he polemicized against British free trade. And there's still some of his speeches people can read. I put some in my appendix of volume 2. So yeah, there was this entire brotherhood, this sense that, okay, Russia, it's because of Russia that the US was able to effectively win their first revolutionary war through Catherine the Great's League of Armed Neutrality. There was a brotherhood, a trust built up with John Quincy Adams, the first ambassador, or an early ambassador of the US to Russia. The building of railway in the 1840s was again made by the Americans, and so they had a common bond. America came in supporting Russia during the Crimean War. Russia came in supporting the US in the Civil War. They helped build the Trans-Siberian. That's why Russia sold Alaska in 1867 to America for $7 million. They sold it because the idea was to then, use that as a springboard for the rail from the across British Columbia, which was, everyone thought at that time that British Canada was going to fall into the hands of the Americans or become its own republic. Either way would have been better. And there were a lot of murders to keep British Canada British at that time, which is part of the shame of Canada's history, which most Canadians are still afraid to look at. But it's there. I mean, if we're going to become a country, we have to look at that. And I mean, all the way up until the defeat of Hitler in World War II, there was a tendency for U.S.-Russian friendship, brotherhood, and a recognition that these civilizations had much more in common than that separated them, and they could trust each other. Like Stalin and Hitler and Roosevelt trusted each other so much more than either one trusted Churchill. Both of them knew that Churchill was a representative of Satan on Earth. So when it was only when Roosevelt died that this really went sour, and Stalin, he believed that Roosevelt was killed. That's what he told Roosevelt's son in an interview, that Churchill's people poisoned your father.
Yeah.
They never did an autopsy, so we'll never know.
Apparently, I think it was always rumored it was, I think, one of his, healthcare workers or maids or something. And then she quickly disappeared after he died, and people were always a bit suspicious. But yeah, I remember coming across that. This is jumping ahead, but I remember coming across that with Stalin and Elliot, and how one particular night, FDR and Churchill was kind of talking about the post World War II world, and those two definitely have two different goals in mind. I'm just wondering, we've been talking for a while. I was wondering if you still wanted to go on, or maybe we could do this to a two-parter a bit later, another time, or it's up to you.
I've got another, I've got till like 8:30 on my side, which is, let's say 20 more minutes I can do.
Okay, right. Thank you. Because I know I've been taking a lot of your time, so
that's fine. And if you want to do something in the future, that's okay too. I'm
right, because there's just so much, so much history. Okay. Moving forward to, I suppose, the interwar period, and with the creation of the ideologies or of communism, fascism, Nazism, I always felt that communism was I think originally supported, I suppose, by the deep state of its day, partly to bring Russia under control and punish them for the Civil War assistance. But I think the ideas, or at least the idealism of communism, started to resonate with everyone worldwide, and maybe even became a threat. So I think they ended up needing a counterforce that would be similar to that, but be more palatable. And and that's why I think Italy, and then later on Germany, kind of came into play. once again, this is a simplified explanation, but do you see um, any truth in that assessment, or and can you kind of go into that
Hmm.
time period?
Well, I think that the nuance that I try to walk a little bit is again that human beings are, we tend to be problem solvers, and we try to figure out how do you you're born into situations that you didn't control. You're sometimes provided an experience that didn't give you a full sense of reality, but you sometimes want to, like, if you're a good person, you will take whatever you can get and you'll try to do something with it. And there's definitely some poisonous pills, like, so embedded within like I've seen, how am I going to word this, because I could approach this in a few different directions. I've seen good people and bad people use capitalism, call themselves capitalists, and use the institution and the theories of capitalism to very different effects based on their intentions and ideas. Some good, some led towards the emancipation of people and the reduction of the power of empire. Others did the opposite. Same thing for like socialism, communism. Some people call themselves communist, but you'll find that they're not ideologically communist. Like, they don't believe that private property is a sin that should be abolished for human beings to have your utopia. Like, like they're more pragmatists. And you'll find that they tend to think for themselves, and they take what they like from Marx and they leave what they don't like. You get this with religious people too, right? They take, reasonable religious people will tend to take what is good and reasonable from their biblical or Quran or Torah, whatever text, and then the things that are irrational, they'll leave it, right? And there you can get really good ecumenical dialogue, peace building measures. A lot of good happens when you have the people who are just like, everything is literally true just because it's in my particular document. That's where you get the germs for war, right? They just don't think for themselves because they're letting their ideology think for them. So I think that with the case of Marx, what you tend to have is a decent critique of empire. So he's criticizing the hypocrisy of British exploitative economics pretty well. And, British economics is pretty bad. Like, just read Oliver Twist or, A Tale of Two Cities. It's pretty bad. That's how it was. Extractive slave labor, just to make money. But he was ignoring the American system entirely in his analysis. He was, if anything, treating Lincoln and Hamilton and the entire American system as if they were just another branch, a sub-branch of British monetarist economy. So right there, that's a big fallacy, because it's two different universes. So a lot of people will be attracted to his critique, and then they'll be like, well, when it comes down to like his application of like the way it should be, I don't really like that. It's not going to work. So I'm going to do things my way. I just want to, like, let's say, end hunger. Let's focus on like how to end hunger, right? And we'll use like the state to plan things in as best as we can to try to end hunger. And we'll try to, like, clean up our backyard. Like, we'll just try to like figure these basic human needs out. And that's generally, and this is where you get the fight between the Trotskyites and the groups around Stalin in the 1920s. And this is where, like, for example, people wonder, like, well, why was it that Trotsky was kicked out of Russia and he was never allowed to go back in? Why was he kicked out in 1927? What was he doing? Well, his version was a more pro-fascist, like he had a more fascist reading of Marx. Like, so he saw communism as being a useful way to attract dumb people into supporting you, unions and other things, while giving the real power to supranational entities above the nation state, which is where things like the new economic policy of Russia, the Soviet Russia, came in 1920, was it 21? Which where Armand Hammer was brought in as like the George Soros character of Russia, right, of the 1920s. That was Armand Hammer. Right. And you had this mass privatization of everything. And the idea was, okay, we need to privatize, and so the power structures, the levers of consumption, production went into the hands of a supranational clique of elites tied to Wall Street in the city of London and the old Russian oligarchs who had still survived and actually arranged for the overthrow of the czars, because some of the oligarchs did that from
Well,
within.
a
Um,
lot of people don't know that Trotsky was, I think he was in New York at one stage. And you know, he was being chauffeured around, had a refrigerator, which was high technology at the time. And yeah, it was very strange considering that. And I think he was trying to get back with Trotsky. I think he was trying to get back into the Russia via Canada. Was it Canada?
yes, he was, and Wilson,
And I think he was stopped
Woodrow
in
Wilson,
Halifax, right?
he
And
got arrested for a month with his
yeah,
family, trying to get back, and Wilson jumped in and got him out. The
yeah,
president of the United States,
that's
who was
right.
behind, he was a puppet for the British, a major player behind the League of Nations, which was itself an attempt to create a one world government as a solution concept to the World War One, Balkan Wars, Bolshevik mess. But luckily it failed because the nationalists of various countries, especially within the U.S., after Wilson died, were too strong, and they didn't let it happen. Thank God. But yeah,
Mhm.
Wilson kicked in, got Trotsky out of prison in Canada, because there was still, again, there was a nationalist movement in Canada that had gotten a good deal of influence. Originally, they came to power under this fellow named Wilfrid Laurier, who was ousted by a roundtable coup in 1911. But his faction came back to power in the 20s, all the way up until 58. Now that's a whole other thing. But read my Untold History of Canada books. If people are listening and they want to know about that story, Untold History of Canada. So yeah, Trotsky was like the bankroller. So he's the guy who was doing all the negotiations with the heavy hitters on Wall Street, as well as he met with Bertrand Russell when Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells went to Moscow. They partied together. You know, you had Milner, who was a major bankroller. I think Anthony Sutton even documents the writings of, I forget who was an investigative reporter who lived through the Bolshevik Revolution and who had documented Milner's gift of $25 million, which is huge sums in those days, to the Bolsheviks. There's a lot of London and Wall Street money behind that. So all that to say, they wanted this Soros version of like a perestroika type of fake communism that would be based upon the control ultimately of private cartels and banks from above, with nominal, frontmen like Trotsky as the socialist savior of the people dictator who would just be overseeing the extraction of wealth of the people, kind of like what Yeltsin was assigned to do. But Trotsky was just, I think, more happy to do it. Yeltsin had to become an alcoholic to do it. And luckily there was enough at that time embedded within the Russian Soviet leadership that had a sense, kind of like Putin and Primakov. Like, this is what the Stalin group, they were not willing to oversee the destruction of Russia. They had access, they had identities tied to their deeper historical continuities that they didn't want to just like watch that be destroyed.
Well,
So there's a fight.
well, yeah, well, that goes back into I suppose, the two Americas, the two Russias, where you had the world revolutionary Trotsky and socialist in one nation Stalin.
Yeah, Trotsky wanted global revolution, right? And that was the whole
Yeah.
thing. Like, Stalin's like, whoa, let's, before we try to burn the world, let's just try to figure out how we can just solve the core problems here. We got starvation, poverty out of the wazoo. Let's just figure out if we can get rid of those things, and then maybe the world will want to like follow our lead. And Trotsky was like, no, let's just burn the world. Let's revolutionary, all the way. And you can see how that would be incompatible. And that's, in that sense, you could criticize Stalin for a variety of reasons, but that was the right orientation compared to the alternative of the Trotsky view of turn the world upside down on behalf of a ruling elite. And that's why also, people, there's been a lot of work to paint the image of Trotsky as if he was the victim of evil Stalin. And Stalin was like kind of like synonymous in many people's minds, including my own mind. For much of my life, I thought Stalin and Hitler were kind of like the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is just when you start digging at original source material and you start looking at where do these narratives come from and what evidence are they using to back it up. It's a big tower of sand. Like Stalin has problems, but no way is he on that level at all. Like when you have like the Moscow trials, where there's the story that he made up he made everything up about this Trotskyite conspiracy to kill him and overthrow his government, right? And create an alliance with Hitler and the pro-fascist British and the Japanese. We're told all that was fake. It's like, no, actually, when you look at the evidence that's especially been declassified in the last 8 years, because a lot of this had 75 years classification, you couldn't even read it if you were in Russia. But now it's coming to the surface. You could read these things. People like Grover Furr is a great researcher who's got an endurance I don't have to go through source material of these transcripts. And it's like, no, there's definitely a very deep state penetration to kill Stalin and all the leadership and bring back Trotsky and align Russia with the Nazis and the pro-fascist British as part of a New World Order agenda with the Japanese fascists. That was the agenda. That was the New World Order that almost happened. And Sutton is a great researcher for some of this stuff, but he misses this because Anthony Sutton as well. He's an ideologue libertarian. So he's looking at the world from the filter of a strict libertarian, which has certain assumptions, such as all examples of state power are all equally tyrannical and thus bad because the only good is personal liberty to do whatever you want. And so every time you have the utilization of state power is a reduction of people's right to do whatever they want to do. And thus that's bad. So you get that problem where in his mind, Roosevelt and Hitler are the same thing as Stalin and Lincoln. They're all equally tyrannical and bad.
Right.
That you miss a lot when you think that way.
I have to admit, even at the very peak of my Ron Paul fandom, and he got up there one stage, I could never really bring myself to be on board with the whole libertarian free trade arguments. For me, even now, I'm an economic nationalist. So
Yeah,
with which someone like Pat Buchanan, who wrote The Great Betrayal, he goes into detail how America really was economic nationalists from Washington to maybe Kennedy. It was
absolutely.
what brought America up was an economic nationalism. It wasn't free trade. So I think that usually gets overlooked. And even Buchanan said he used to be a free trader, but then when he realized what the history and what was going on, as soon as he said economic nationalist, he had people that used to be his friend just basically don't want to know him anymore, because I think free trade became like a religion. It became like you're a heretic if you kind of go against that type of thinking. But really, it was that's what Trump was. Trump was free leaning towards nationalism too. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, use the nation to do good because the nation is the people. Like, and in that sense, private enterprise is great. State, the use of the state to create climate for building something really big as a mega project, that's great too. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have both. I mean, you can't understand anything JFK did if you don't look at how both of those things blossomed, and you're not going to categorize that as socialist or free market capitalist. He didn't see a problem of the two. It's a false dichotomy. Same thing for Putin today, it's much of the Eurasian leadership. That's how they're able to build things, and you still have a blossoming of private sector enterprise.
Even Charles de Gaulle, he went that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
For me, economic nationalism incorporates many of the arguments of the free traders, but it still wants a level playing field. It still wants to protect it, give its own industries a fighting chance. But the free traders, they don't seem to get that. They just hear that, they go, statism, communism, and they don't want to hear it. That's
Yeah,
why
yeah.
FDR is a weird one. I've heard, I'm kind of on the fence with him. I've heard too many conflicting stories to get really on top of good guy, bad guy, what to make of him. But
Man, like in my analysis, and he takes up like 6 chapters in my volume 2 of the Clash of the Two Americas. I did a pretty deep dive in not just his economic policies, but also the fifth columnists, because most people, they analyze FDR without taking into consideration what were the fifth columnists, the deep state that was around him in his time that he had to deal with. They
mhm,
don't look at that. And so
mhm,
they oversimplify and thus make a lot of, I think, mistakes in their incisions when they're trying to like cut out their picture of what reality is.
mhm,
But I think when you take into consideration what we're talking about of the British Roundtable movement that was taking over the State Department, we look at the Keynesian operation, which is a Fabian Society operation deeply embedded, again, at that time, into the US State Department and civil service. Because FDR was not a Keynesian, by the way. It's anybody who says that does not. I mean, FDR called Keynes an economic fetishist, which, when you actually look at Keynes' own writings and how he mathematically tried to like trace out his sexual exploits with young underage boys,
oh,
he
really?
was this real sick fetishistic mathematician, and he was also a sadomasochist. He got a certain pleasure out of providing pain.
Didn't learn that one
Um,
in school, but all right.
yeah, no, no, I mean, he was a high level Cambridge apostle. Like this is one of the, you don't become a Cambridge apostle easily. You have to have been tapped on the shoulders and passed through a lot of fires in order to like elevate yourself. It's like Bertrand Russell, Cambridge apostle. There's very few. But that's like higher level grand strategist. Now he was set up in the London Times in 32 to have a controlled debate with a friend of his, a lifelong friend named Friedrich von Hayek. And
Mhm.
the von Hayek-Keynes debate became a false dichotomy between two different opposing ways to solve the Great Depression, both of which were wrong, because both of which obeyed certain assumptions that we see with the, you know, state good, individual bad, or individual negligible versus only individual good, state bad. It's like this false thing. But that worked really hard. It was amplified to create this choice that everyone thought that they had to make. Roosevelt didn't make that choice. He was like, no, I believe in Lincoln. And he even said, we're going to commandeer Lincoln from the Republican Party, because the Republican Party by that time became the party of Wall Street. So he was working to reform the Democratic Party itself. Why didn't we get a one world government in 1933? You had the London Conference of 65 nations being brought in to create a one world government under a banker's dictatorship, under the Bank of International Settlements and the Bank of England. It was a 6-month long conference. It failed. Why did this Great Reset conference to deal with the Great Depression fail? It was because Roosevelt pulled out the United States delegations from all meetings and just sabotaged it. He torpedoed it. And it basically fell apart to the point that they needed to then like launch into an assassination attempt. So he has like 2 assassination attempts. The first one in February of 33, right? With Giuseppe Zangara, the Freemason anarchist, who tries
Mhm.
to shoot him, but a woman in the audience hits his hand and he ends up killing the mayor of Chicago, Cermak.
That's right. Mhm.
Then you have the bankers coup, right, in 34. That's luckily it fails because Smedley Butler, the general,
Mhm.
whistle and takes names and goes to Congress, and then he goes to the people. When the Congress won't act the way he wants them to, he luckily goes into and records his voice and projects it across radios all over the U.S. to educate the people how these J.P. Morgan bankers, who by the way are also running the American Liberty League to keep the U.S. out of the war and to subvert the New Deal. He's the whole JP Morgan Mellon banking cartel are behind the American Liberty League. They're also, why do they want to keep America out of the war with Hitler? It's because that's part of the Trotsky British global New World Order, is that they would have a piece of the global pie. They have a jurisdiction for North America, while Hitler would control the Eurasian zone, right? With the help of Trotsky being the peon of the Nazi regime. And Mussolini would have his territory, and Franco would have his territory in South America, and the Japanese would have their Asian territories, and Britain would have India and a big chunk of Africa. And that was how the world was going to be carved up. And the American bankers had they had their promised jurisdictions. That's why they didn't want to have the US in the war. And that's why they wanted to kill Roosevelt and put their own guy in as a fascist, which is what Smedley Butler said. So, and then you have the whole war against Wall Street. Like, why did Wall Street lose their power, right? Why were the banks broken up? Did they do it to themselves, or was there a fight? It's like, no, Roosevelt empowered Ferdinand Pecora to break up the banks with Glass-Steagall, to bring in the SEC, to force oversight for the first time. That never happened before. So bankers couldn't gamble with people's savings, and they had to abide by certain like actual laws of the nation. And then things like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was created, which by the end of World War II had provided more loans to the real economy than all of the private banks combined. It acted like a national bank when Roosevelt couldn't get a national bank, which was vetoed, or not vetoed, but it was subverted in the Senate. He created he took the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and made it function like a Hamiltonian national bank, which provided loans, could create sub-corporations that were, had basically the government would be the primary shareholder, but then you could use these corporations to build things like the Tennessee Valley Authority or the rural electrification projects or whatever else. There were thousands of dams, big and small projects, some make work, some really big. So, you had this whole multi-level approach to this process of healing the US from the self-induced Great Depression, which was self-induced because the bankers did it to themselves in 29, right? They had a controlled demolition of their banking system with the broker call loan in 29 and Black Tuesday. So they did that to create the excuse to have then shock therapy and usher in a one world government under a banker's dictatorship. That didn't work because Roosevelt sabotaged it. The US was able to heal itself sufficiently to be able to even enter the war because of these massive building projects. He had to contend with. He spoke to Eliot about the fifth columnist that he couldn't trust that had taken over his own State Department. He talked about that even up until 1944, right before he died. So I mean, honestly, he's a pretty solid guy. Like he would rarely say what he thought because he was wise. He wouldn't just you wanted to say things we want politicians to sound like JFK, all of them. And he wouldn't always do that. He plays cards kind of like Putin sometimes, he says one thing, does another, or Trump would say something, do another. That's how a lot of these people have to act because they have to stay alive. And I don't know about Pearl Harbor. People say, oh, but look Pearl Harbor. He knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. I've looked at the various models that have explained how Roosevelt had foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor. I think that there was foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor. I think that Churchill's signals de-encryption outpost in Australia had already de-encrypted messaging indicating a day before that this was going to happen. And he actually went out of his way to ensure that those messages did not make their way to Franklin Roosevelt. Did the 6 months earlier, did the barricade on Japanese supplies affect? Was that the cause? Did that nobly provoke Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor? No. That's what people say. It's like, oh, look, he barricaded, he cut the supplies off of promised oil and other commodities for the Japanese war machine, and thus he planned it. He made them. He knew that 6 months later they were going to attack, and it's like, that's a bit of a leap you're asking everyone to make. There's no Japan is at war with, they're committing atrocities with the Chinese and many others. You're not at war, but you have every right to cut off the supplies of oil and hydrocarbons and stuff. Which, by the way, they're still providing. Like Rockefeller Standard Oil is still providing all of these things to the Hitler machine throughout the war. Right? All that to say, I'm not convinced at all that FDR was running the inside job of Pearl Harbor. And the other thing I would say is ultimately, okay, once the consent was given, because the people were generally not in favor of getting into the war. Okay, after Pearl Harbor, there was a popular consent that, okay, it's worth going into the war. But it's would you have preferred that the US not go into the war? Right? That's what I'm talking to people. In my mind, it's would you have preferred that Hitler had won that war? Would that have been a better outcome? Okay, that's another debate that we have to have. It's if that's the case, right? Is okay. So all that to say, yeah, FDR's and also JFK. JFK organized many of the best economic policies that were revolutionary, both for Africa and many other parts of the world, including the United States, water projects, other things, through his studies of FDR's New Deal. He studied that thoroughly. He looked at how it was done. He looked at the banking mechanisms. He worked with Eleanor Roosevelt, Charles de Gaulle as well, and a lot of old school allies of FDR who were still in power. So there's a whole bunch of ways of looking at this thing.
Mm-hmm.
All leads to the same sort of conclusion that FDR was not on the side of the bad guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much for coming on, and such a deep, interesting conversation. I would still like to have you back on, and I suppose bring us from that period to maybe today. But
Sure.
that'll be another 2-3 hours.
Yeah, man. This is fun. I like the format, and I'm passionate about these ideas. You are too, so for sure. I mean, we'll make the time. Just give me a call, and we'll do it. I know the 14-hour difference in time is a bit weird, but we'll make it work.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you once again for coming on, and we'll talk again shortly.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
See you, Daniel.